ครับขอต้อนรับสมาชิกสรท9และผู้เข้าร่วมรับฟังออนไลน์เวบินาร์ในวันนี้ทุกท่านนะครับผมรองศาสตราจารย์ทันตแพทย์ดร.อธิพันธ์พิมพ์ขาวขำมีรับหน้าที่มาเป็น Moderator นะครับแล้วก็เป็นผู้ดูแลในเรื่องของสรท9 StudyClub ในวันนี้นะครับก่อนอื่นขอเริ่มจากเปิดเนื่องจากว่าของเราเวบินาร์คราวนี้เนี่ยเป็นครั้งแรกนะครับซึ่งสรท9เนี่ยเป็นหนึ่งหน่วยงานในมูลนิธิทันตนวัตกรรมในพระบรมราชูปถัมภ์ก็ก่อนอื่นเราขอเริ่มจากการเปิดอย่างเป็นทางการโดยท่านคุณวรวุฒินะครับขอเชิญรับชมเลยครับ
สวัสดีครับผมชื่อวรวุฒิกุลแก้วนะครับเป็นเลขาธิการมูลนิธิทันตนวัตกรรมในพระบรมราชูปถัมภ์นะครับซึ่งอยู่ในหน่วยทันตกรรมพระราชทานในพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวนะครับในวันนี้ก็ในส่วนที่ผมเกี่ยวข้องจะขออนุญาตเล่าที่มาที่ไปของศูนย์พัฒนารากฟันเทียมไทยเฉลิมพระเกียรติพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่9นะครับแล้วก็ถามว่าทำไมต้องมาทำเวบินาร์ครั้งที่1นี้เกิดขึ้นนะครับสรท9หรือศูนย์พัฒนารากฟันเทียมไทยเฉลิมพระเกียรติพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวเนี่ยนะครับก็เกิดขึ้นจากพระมหากรุณาธิคุณของพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่9นะครับในคราวที่ท่านได้เสด็จไปทำรักษาพระทนโดยทันตกรรมรากฟันเทียมนะครับจากทีมทันตแพทย์ประจำพระองค์ก็คือศาสตราจารย์พิเศษทันตแพทย์หญิงท่านผู้หญิงเพชราเตชะกัมพุทธนะครับรองศาสตราจารย์ทันตแพทย์หญิงคุณเมตจิตนวจินดานะครับแล้วก็ผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ทันตแพทย์วิจิตรธารานนท์ซึ่งเป็นทีมทันตแพทย์ประจำพระองค์นะครับในคราวนั้นท่านได้มีรับสั่งหลังจากที่ได้รับการถวายการรักษารากฟันเทียมนะครับว่าทำอย่างไร30 บาทรักษาได้หรือไม่นะครับแล้วก็ทรงรับสั่งถึงสมเด็จย่าก็คือสมเด็จพระศรีนครินทราบรมราชชนนีนะครับว่าถ้าท่านยังมีพระชนชีพอยู่เนี่ยอยากให้ท่านได้ใส่รากฟันเทียมเช่นกันนะครับนั่นเป็นที่มาของการพูดถึงรากฟันเทียมขึ้นมาครั้งแรกๆในประเทศไทยนะครับต่อมาเมื่อทรงทราบว่ารากฟันเทียมที่ได้รับการรักษาจากทันตแพทย์นั้นน่ะนำเข้ามาจากต่างประเทศนะครับและมีราคาแพงมากนะครับซี่หนึ่งเป็นแสนนะครับท่านก็มีรับสั่งว่าทันตแพทย์เนี่ยควรจะมีหลากหลายนะครับไม่ควรจะรักษาอย่างเดียวควรทำวิจัยและพัฒนาด้วยนะครับอันนี้เป็นที่มาของการศึกษาวิจัยและพัฒนารากฟันเทียมไทยขึ้นมานะครับตอนนั้นคุณหมอวิจิตรธารานนท์นะครับซึ่งเป็นหนึ่งในทีมทันตแพทย์ประจำพระองค์นะครับก็ได้ทำการวิจัยและพัฒนาขึ้นมาในศูนย์ก็เรียกว่า AdTech ศูนย์เทคโนโลยีทางทันตกรรมขั้นสูงนะครับซึ่งสมัยนั้นอาจารย์วิจิตรก็อยู่ในสวทช.นะครับรากฟันเทียมในประเทศไทยก็เกิดขึ้นมาในช่วงปี 2546 เป็นต้นมานะครับแล้วก็ได้ผลิตขึ้นมาในประเทศนะครับแล้วก็ในปี 2550 นะครับก็เกิดโครงการรากฟันเทียมเฉลิมพระเกียรติพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวนะครับในวโรกาสเฉลิมพระชนมพรรษา 80 พรรษานะครับประชาชนในประเทศก็ได้ใส่รากฟันเทียม 10,000 คนนะครับแต่ว่าเป็นแบบ complete denture นะครับคือเป็นแบบฟันเทียมแบบทั้งปากในปี 2554 นะครับก็ได้ใส่รากฟันเทียมอีก 8,400 คนนะครับรวมแล้วเป็น 18,400 คนนะครับซึ่งในคราวนั้นพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่ 9 ก็ได้พระราชทานชื่อรากฟันเทียมไว้ว่าข้าวอร่อยนะครับชื่อนี้เป็นชื่อพระราชทานซึ่งมีความสำคัญต่อวิชาชีพทันตกรรมอย่างมากนะครับในปี 2552 นะครับพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่ 9 ก็มีพระบรมราชานุญาตให้จัดตั้งมูลนิธิทันตนวัตกรรมในพระบรมราชูปถัมภ์ขึ้นในหน่วยทันตกรรมพระราชทานในพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวนะครับซึ่งมูลนิธิก็ได้ทำวิจัยและพัฒนาแล้วก็ดูแลหน่วยทันตกรรมพระราชทานด้วยงานวิจัยและพัฒนาของมูลนิธินะครับก็แบ่งเป็นหลายส่วนเช่น medical food อาหารทางการแพทย์นะครับ medical devices เครื่องมือแพทย์นะครับ pharmaceutical ก็คือเรื่องเวชภัณฑ์ทั้งหลายแล้วก็มีmedical services ก็คือการให้บริการด้านทันตกรรมนะครับในส่วนเรื่องของเครื่องมือแพทย์นะครับมูลนิธิก็ได้ทำวิจัยและพัฒนาหลายอย่างเช่นรากฟันเทียมนะครับ craniofacial implant นะครับ plate and screw นะครับBAM bone anchor maxillary protection นะครับbone filler นะครับแล้วก็ยังมี fluoride varnish มี sealant นะครับในปี 2563 นะครับถ้าจำไม่ผิดในวันที่ 29 มกราคม 2563 นะครับคณะกรรมการมูลนิธิก็มีมติให้ตั้งแผนกเดิมก็คือวิจัยและพัฒนาเครื่องมือแพทย์ยกฐานะขึ้นเป็นส่วนงานเรียกว่าศูนย์พัฒนารากฟันเทียมไทยเฉลิมพระเกียรติพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่ 9 หรือต่อไปนี้เราก็จะเรียกชื่อย่อว่าสรท 9 นะครับในสรท 9 นี้เนี่ยจะมีอยู่2แผนกสำคัญนะครับก็คือแผนกวิจัยและพัฒนานะครับเครื่องมือแพทย์นะครับแล้วก็อีกแผนกหนึ่งก็คือแผนกวิชาการและถ่ายทอดเทคโนโลยีนะครับในแผนกวิชาการและถ่ายทอดเทคโนโลยีนี้ยังมีอยู่4งานซึ่งเป็นงานสำคัญก็คืออันที่1เราใช้คำว่า Training Center นะครับเป็นที่จะฝึกอบรมทันตแพทย์ในกระทรวงสาธารณสุขทันตแพทย์ในภาคเอกชนในการที่จะทำหัตถการทางด้านเครื่องมือแพทย์ต่อไปในอนาคตนะครับอันที่2เราใช้คำว่าสรท 9 StudyClub นะครับหรือชมรมสรท 9 นะครับซึ่งเป็นที่มาของการจัดเวบินาร์ครั้งนี้นะครับสรท 9 StudyClub ก็ได้เชิญชวนทันตแพทย์ที่ได้ทำโครงการรากฟันเทียมของพระบาทสมเด็จพระเจ้าอยู่หัวทันตแพทย์ที่ทำโครงการรากฟันเทียมในแผนผู้สูงอายุนะครับเข้ามาเป็นสมาชิกแล้วก็ได้มีหน้าที่ที่จะสื่อสารความรู้ทางวิชาการต่างๆนะครับอันที่3งานในสรท 9 ในแผนกวิชาการก็คือเราใช้ชื่อภาษาอังกฤษว่า ISMB International Symposium for Medical Devices and Biomaterial นะครับอันนี้จะเป็นการประชุมวิชาการนานาชาติที่สำคัญซึ่งจะจัดขึ้นในปีถัดไปเนื่องจากว่าติดปัญหาโควิดนะครับก็เลยต้องปีนี้จัดไม่ได้แล้วก็อีกอันหนึ่งก็คือpublication ก็จะเป็นการออกวารสารหรือการตีพิมพ์ในวารสารนานาชาติต่างๆนะครับใน publication เราได้ออก e-newsletter ขึ้นมาฉบับที่1ไปแล้วนะครับชื่อนักคลินทันตรักษานะครับซึ่งอันนี้ทันตแพทย์ก็สามารถที่จะไปโหลดดูในเว็บไซต์ของมูลที่ทันตนวัตกรรมในพระบรมราชูปถัมภ์ได้นะครับผมขอย้อนมาในส่วนที่เป็นสรท 9 StudyClub นะครับซึ่งวันนี้เนี่ยสรท 9 StudyClub ได้จัดเวบินาร์ขึ้นมาครั้งแรกนะครับโดยที่ได้เชิญอาจารย์ผู้มีชื่อเสียงนะครับทั้งในประเทศและต่างประเทศได้เข้ามาร่วมนะครับวันนี้ก็จะเป็นครั้งที่1ซึ่งจะจัดขึ้นในวันที่24 มกราคม 2565 เนี่ยนะครับในช่วงเวลาประมาณสัก 5 โมงเย็นเนี่ยนะครับผมก็ในฐานะเลขาธิการมูลที่ทันตนวัตกรรมในพระบรมราชูปถัมภ์นะครับก็ขอเชิญชวนทันตแพทย์ผู้ที่เป็นสมาชิกและก็ผู้ที่เกี่ยวข้องในการที่จะได้อัปเดตความรู้แล้วก็พัฒนาความรู้ต่างๆที่จะเกิดขึ้นในประเทศและต่างประเทศนะครับได้เข้ามาร่วมรับฟังนะครับแล้วก็ได้ช่วยกันพัฒนาบ้านเมืองเราให้เจริญก้าวหน้าในสาขาที่เราเกี่ยวข้องนะครับสำหรับผมก็เล่าที่มาที่ไปแล้วก็สรุปได้ดังนี้นะครับก็เป็นหน้าที่ของอาจารย์ดร.อธิพันธ์พิมพ์ขาวขำที่จะดำเนินการต่อไปนะครับขอบคุณครับ
ครับก็ขอบคุณท่านคุณวรวุฒินะครับเลขาธิการของมูลนิธินะครับที่ได้เล่าถึงที่มาที่ไปนะครับแล้วก็ได้กล่าวเปิดงานในวันนี้นะครับซึ่งในวันนี้เนี่ยเป็นครั้งแรกนะครับของสรท 9 StudyClub ที่จัดเป็นออนไลน์เวบินาร์ขึ้นนะครับก็ขอต้อนรับสมาชิกStudyClub ทุกท่านที่เพิ่งเข้ามานะครับรวมถึง ผู้ฟังทางออนไลน์เว็บบินาร์ทุกท่านด้วยครับเดี๋ยวผมขออนุญาตเริ่มให้รู้จักกับท่านวิทยากรนิดนึงนะครับเป็นภาษาอังกฤษนิดนึงนะครับเนื่องจากวิทยากรของเราเป็นผู้ที่มาจากต่างประเทศนะครับก็ first of all I would like to introduce our speaker today Professor Nikos Mattheos. Currently he is the staff on a visiting professor at the Department of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery Faculty of Dentistry Chulalongkorn University and his topic today is the update in Peri-Implant soft tissue. So please welcome Professor Nikos Mattheos.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. Dear friends, dear colleagues, welcome and many greetings from Bangkok and King's Rama 9 Dental Innovation Center. Also, a lot of greetings from Chulalongkorn University and the Department of Oral Maxillofacial Surgery, where I'm currently based. To introduce myself, very few things. My name is Nikos Mattheos. I would describe myself first and foremost as an academic teacher, clinician, and researcher with focus in implant dentistry for the last 20 years. Now, today we are here in this inaugural webinar of the Dental Innovation Foundation to discuss about the peri-implant tissue. And I'm sure you have all had enough anatomy and physiology and histology when we're discussing about the soft tissue. But since this is an innovation foundation and we're living in a time where implant dentistry is changing rapidly, today I would like to approach it a little bit from an unconventional angle. And I would like to see the peri-implant tissue as part of a wider system and also as part of the new emerging paradigms of how we perceive implant dentistry today. And as I'm sure you all know, it is a great transformation period for implant dentistry and for the dentistry as a whole. And that, of course, has been initiated by digital technology, which is not only changing the way that we are performing procedures, it is also starting to change the way we see things, the way we perceive implant dentistry, and the way we perceive a treatment with implants as a whole. So we are living in a change of rapid paradigm shift. And paradigm is a very, very critical parameter in everything we do because it defines our perspective and somehow it limits our potential. When we start to see things differently, it is then when we unlock a potential that we never thought possible. And I think implant dentistry today is approaching many of these areas. Now, to discuss a little bit about the paradigm shift and how peri-implant tissue fit in the bigger, wider change of conceiving implant dentistry today, allow me to go a little bit back. We're living in a time where we hear all about digital revolution. I must say that I am old enough to have heard about digital revolution many times and since many years. Apparently, my first computer is what you see here in the picture. It was conceived by a pioneer, an English pioneer, Alan Sinclair, who recently passed away, and it had a memory of 1 kilobyte. Today, 1 kilobyte is not enough to write your name on a document. But at that time, you could program thousands of lines and do quite a lot of things. So as time goes by, we even wrote a book about the digital clinic in 2004, published in Sweden. If you ever come across this book, please do not read it. It is heavily obsolete by now, as an indication of how quickly things change. Let me tell you some of the things I learned with one of the first times I encountered the word digital revolution. You see, as a teenager, I had a very big collection of LPs. I would use my pocket money to go to the record store, buy a new LP, and then bring it home, put it on the LP player, and enjoy the music. And that was music for me. Until the time came where something emerged as digital revolution, and then suddenly it was all on a CD player. And I was very happy about it, jumped into the opportunity, bought a CD player, and from this point started to do exactly the same thing. I was going to the record store, I was buying a CD, bringing it home, and play it on my CD player. So you see the technology changed dramatically, but how revolutionary was this? We were actually doing the same thing in a different way, more or less, until someone else came and changed forever how we see music. He invented a different concept of music. And after the MP3 was invented, music was no longer a physical product that you go to the record store to buy and come home to play, but it became something that was not really physically substantial, and you could really convert it in many different ways, media and approaches. And this opened up a whole amazing potential of things that changed our life forever. Someone created a digital platform on the cloud where you could now share all this music and exchange it. Of course, this Napster, the first platform, was killed very quickly, but not before it gave birth to the big mega stores of music that we can experience today legally. And of course, all this followed by many different ideas, innovations, where the sound was converted into many, many different applications and formats. And that was truly revolutionary. That was what changed our life. So you see, the technological evolution is something that comes first, the change in the technology, which in the beginning looks like we're doing something that we used to do, but in a different way. But eventually, at some point, the paradigm shifts. We perceive things that we couldn't perceive before, and this is where the true revolution happens, and the true change is actually hitting the application. So where are we in implant dentistry right now? What is the paradigm of implant dentistry? How has technology changed the way we perceive implant dentistry or the peri-implant soft tissue as such? Well, to discuss a little bit about this, of course, we have a lot of technology, and the technology has changed the way we practice. But are we now in the way that we're starting to change the way we think, we perceive, we conceptualize implant dentistry? To do that, let's look at the first paradigm that came across. What was implant dentistry when it was first conceived? Here you can see the first textbook by Peri-Implamt, and one of the things that I really love about it is the title. The original title was Tissue Integration. Of course, what happened in the first decades of implant dentistry was that the subheading took over and dominated. And then osseointegration became the determining paradigm of implant dentistry, the synonym of implant dentistry and the focus of implant dentistry research, practice and activity for the first few decades was osseointegration. And that means that the whole concept of implant dentistry was to achieve osseointegration, to place the implants where the bone was better fit to give quality osseointegration, and then eventually someone will come connecting the dots and place a full arch reconstruction on top on the basis that we have created. But that was the wound healing in the presence of a foreign body. Is this what we define implant dentistry today? Is this where we focus our attention and energy? What is the modern paradigm of implant dentistry today when we have resolved to a great extent many of the challenges of osseointegration? Where do we look to get our paradigms? And sometimes we look in science, sometimes it's even more inspiring to look in science fiction. For example, what you see here is some famous characters from science fiction. To the left side of your screen, you see the Hollywood ones, Western ones, maybe a little bit less talkative and more shooting. To the right is my favorite ones, which are the Eastern ones, the Japanese ones, which are much more complex personalities. So what you see is what we call in science fiction cyborgs, a man-machine system. Now, you might be surprised, cyborg is not a word that comes from science fiction. It actually comes from science. It was first reported in a scientific publication in the 60s by two NASA scientists. So these two people were envisioning the way that technology would change our lives in the future. And one of the things that they foretell was that we will use technology and technological devices to enhance our own bodies. to adapt to the environment by means of merging technology and human tissue. And I read directly their definition, which was a man-machine system which incorporates exogenous components functioning as an integrated, self-regulated homeostatic system fully adapted to the environment. And to this day, I must say, if I would like to have a definition of what an implant is today, I think that would describe it in the best way. This is how I would like to see our implants today, not as a foreign body that also integrates, but creating a whole new system, which includes human tissue, includes mechanical components and bacteria, into a long-term, stable, successful new organ or environment. And that would be the paradigm I would like to see in implant dentistry today. So we have the osseointegration, we have the prosthesis, which is the visible thing in the mouth, defining function and aesthetics, and now the focus comes not in these two components that are very well developed, but what comes exactly in the middle. This component that includes human tissue, bacteria, mechanical components, and which we will describe as the implant supracrestal complex. Now this is the twilight zone, and this is the hottest area of attention today in implant dentistry, because this will be the area which will determine success or failure or problems in the long term, not in the osseointegration. And the peri-implant tissue is just one part of this system, the supracrestal complex. Now, often we compare the peri-implant tissue with the periodontal tissue. We have, however, to bear in mind always that periodontal tissue is a physiological tissue. By that, it means that it's a tissue that has evolved through an evolution of millions of years to serve a purpose, and it can serve this purpose very well. On the other hand, peri-implant tissue is not a physiological tissue. It does not exist anywhere in the body before we create it by placing an implant with a surgical trauma and implanting a device. So it is a repair tissue. It is a tissue the body has created in response to a cause. And this cause is very important, and we have to study the tissues in relation to the cause that created, which is the implant, the abutment, and the prosthesis complex. So if you want to look at it, the peri-implant tissue and the implant components is two sides of the different coin. You can't have one without the other. And you can't have a different value on one side of the coin and a different value on the other. And some time ago, we tried to describe and define this complex by somehow streamlining the terminology of the anatomic parts, and also by defining all the interrelations between them. So we focused into the different critical components from the implant side, the different tissue which is involved from the human tissue side, of course, the role of the bacteria and the biofilm, and try to streamline and understand a terminology that follows the whole complex in one direction. And that will be the first thing that I would like to discuss a little bit more in detail. How do we perceive the peri-implant tissue today as part of this unique system, of this supracrestal complex? I would like to depict it as a four-story house. A house where many different families live, and in the same way, a place where many different tissue synergize. So at the baseline, at the bottom of the house, we have the bone and we have the osseointegration. At the same time, however, it's not only the implant, it is also an abutment, it is an abutment screw, and there is a very specific configuration of all this, which we call the connection, which can take many different ways. Now, why is it important to study all this in parallel? Because exactly, very often the problems that are manifested in one part of the system are because of deficiencies or causes in another. For example, deficiencies in the screw can actually be first manifested as problems in the marginal bone. And we won't be able to find the cause unless we really know the interrelation between all the components of the system. On top of this, on the first floor, we have the tenons, who is the connective tissue. The connective tissue is sitting on top of the bone and is loosely adhering to the surface of the abutment or the implant. There is no real attachment there. There is only a very tight contact which is supported by the collagen fibers that go all around the implant surface. This circumferential, like a rubber dam collagen fibers. Now, on the second floor, we have the junctional epithelium. And this is on top of the collagen tissue, and this exactly is the first zone of true attachment, because there we have hemidesmosomes, like little suctions, are sticking on top of the metal surface, of the titanium surface, or the abutment surface accordingly, and this is probably the first tight seal separating the oral environment with the underlying tissue. And on the penthouse, we have one of the most critical elements in implant dentistry today, the peri-implant sulcus. And this is now a very tiny schismoid space where the epithelial cells on one side are not adhering or attached to the implant, but they create a very tiny space which brings the oral environment in contact with the tissue. On top of that, we have a prosthesis, or let's say the roof of the house, which is very critical because this is where the biofilm accumulates. This is where the oral environment creates biofilm in the mouth. And this is where the bacteria will first come to interact with the tissue and establish a very, very fragile balance of health or disease. Now, we might have some guest stars in this ecosystem. We might have some cement material or some biomaterial that are parts of augmentations, and they blend in with the soft tissue depending on the procedures that we have used, rightly or sometimes in an unpredictable way. And all this is living together in a cohabitation model. Now, cohabitation is very important. It means that we live together and we synergize and interrelate with each other. And you know, like in a building with many families, cohabitation can take many directions. We can have a good collaboration where everybody is respecting each other and we live happily, or we can have problems. We can have someone being very loud and someone else being very annoyed and creating trouble, calling the police. And that's a cohabitation that is problematic and go wrong. And actually, this is the model that today we use in order to understand more and more disease, especially chronic disease like inflammation, as an ecology that has gone into a wrong direction. This is another major important paradigm shift. And many things can go wrong, you know, in implant reconstruction. Just to name the most common problems that we see in complications in the long term. From the soft tissue side, we can have inflammation-related complications like mucositis and peri-implantitis. We can have recession and aesthetic complications related to the soft tissue. From the technical side, we can have problems with the screws, with the abutments, and even with the veneering of the prosthesis, which sometimes can be also attributed to a very, very tiny small space. All these problems have their birth, their generating cause in some of these components where the soft tissue, the implants, and the abutments and the components meet, the supracrestal complex. So today we have a different paradigm between health and disease. 200 years ago, when Pasteur discovered the microbial causes of disease and came up to establish the paradigm of presence of certain bacteria brings disease, eliminating these bacteria brings health. Today, however, we see more and more when we have complex chronic inflammatory diseases, we're no longer talking about the presence of specific bacteria or the absence of them. We're talking about a balance, that the bacteria that are present are in balance with the host mechanisms and the environment, and this balance is manifested as symbiosis, cohabitation where people live happily together, or dysbiosis, the cohabitation that went wrong and created a lot of problems. So all this tissue and all these mechanical components together with the biofilm can constitute one happily living community, or can manifest problems. And here comes a very important responsibility, because we are the ones who actually design the system by selecting the implant, by designing the prosthesis, and by determining how and where the supracrestal complex will be in the component side. So looking at these two sides of the same coin, the tissue side and the component side, we can now define some specific anatomic positions. On the implant side, on the prosthesis, we have the cervical margin, which is the part of the prosthesis that comes in contact with the soft tissues first. That corresponds to the mucosa margin of the side of the soft tissues. Underneath, the space between the mucosal margin and the bone is actually what is the emergence profile. And here we have the side of the tissues, which we just described, with the junctional epithelium, the connective tissue, and so on. But we also have the side of the components, which is very detailed, because it includes a lot of different bits and pieces, which come together with specific junctions. We have the implant abutment junction, we have the abutment prosthesis junction. In some configurations, we might even have a direct junction between the implant and the prosthesis. So all these gaps and all these junctions have a clinical role, because they can act as plaque retention or micro leakage channels or micromobility possibilities depending on the configuration of the implant, and they have a very specific matching area on the soft tissue side. So the fit of the component, the design of the component, the use of different cements or of different biomaterial, it all matters, because it all will influence this very sensitive, unique system that we create with our design. Let's look at this now a little bit closer in the patient mouth. Here you see what the tissue looks like when we remove the prosthesis and the abutment from an anterior implant. And we have now again the two sides of the different coin. We see the tissue and we see the prosthesis side. At the bottom, at the base, we have the attachment zone. So we have the connective tissue and the junctional epithelium, as we discussed before. And that corresponds, of course, to the part of the cervical margin of the prosthesis. Now, the rest, all the way to the top of the soft tissues, the mucosa margin, this is the sulcus, the peri-implant sulcus, which can have very different depth configuration if we're looking in the buccal, or if we're looking in this case in the interproximal space, mesial and distal. And this deep peri-implant sulcus might be a very important parameter to study today in implant dentistry. Why? Because, of course, mouth is full of bacteria. Bacteria, as we said, live in the mouth. They have always lived in the mouth, and it is good that they are in the mouth because they serve a purpose. Of course, could this be now a risk? Could this be a challenge? Could we have an increased risk because of a deep peri-implant sulcus, as in this case? Well, we have to clarify something very important here. The bacteria who live in the mouth is not really the true risk in a planktonic state. No bacteria is going to just dive into the sulcus, go to the very bottom of the sulcus and start creating inflammation. No, the peri-implant tissue inflammation, mucositis and peri-implantitis, does not start at the bottom of the sulcus. It starts where the biofilm accumulates. And where does the biofilm accumulate? It is right at the top. It is exactly on the prosthesis. Biofilm requires two important parameters. It requires a liquid environment and it requires a hard surface. And these two exist on top of the prosthesis. So the biofilm will first accumulate on the prosthesis, and the first contact of the biofilm with the soft tissues will happen at the mucosal margin, exactly where the prosthesis meets the soft tissue. Now, if we remove it from this zone, then it will not mature into a pathogenic biofilm causing inflammation. And how do we remove it? Of course, professional maintenance and oral hygiene from the patient side. But if you allow it to accumulate long enough, after 3 weeks already, it will create peri-implant mucositis. And that is very well evident. So it doesn't really matter in my mind how deep is the sulcus. What matters is how accessible is the mucosa margin to oral hygiene and how well the patient can clean. And even in a deep sulcus, the patient who can clean and can have access for oral hygiene all around the crown in the mucosal margin will keep the peri-implant tissues healthy. So let's have a small checkpoint here to summarize the discussion so far. First of all, inflammation of the peri-implant soft tissue is a very common problem, but is a direct result of biofilm accumulation, not individual bacteria infection in the bottom of the sulcus. And the anatomic and the physiological differences, of course, of the peri-implant and the periodontal tissue, together with the design of the prosthesis, will influence the initiation and the progression of inflammation, as we said, starting from the mucosal margin and, if established, going deeper. Finally, peri-implant sulcus is today a very critical parameter because it relates with the aesthetic outcomes. You can't have an aesthetic implant placement in the anterior without creating a deep peri-implant sulcus interproximally. So it is something that we have to be aware. Being deep, it can be still compatible with health, but we have to really make sure that our design allows for oral hygiene and the patient can practice. And we will discuss more details in the continuation of our presentation. Now, moving forward, we wanted in a second study to collect the evidence for all the possible different ways we have to influence the outcomes by manipulating the tissue or the components, the design elements of the implant supracrestal complex. In other words, what are the things we can do when we design this little space in order to influence long-term health or eventually predispose to problems and disease? And we have identified quite a lot of areas of interest. I will not go into all the details in this short presentation today, but I would like to bring up a few in particular the emergence profiles and angles, and also the soft tissue height and the way that we can use it in our favor. Now, talking about the soft tissue height, how much soft tissue do we need in a vertical dimension in order to secure that we have all the outcomes we're looking for? Health, aesthetics, sustainability, but also function and proper balance. As we said, the cervical margin of the prosthesis or the mucosal margin of the soft tissue will be what determines the aesthetics. And then we have to design this transition zone, the zone that starts from the implant platform and meets the marginal cervical margin in that point. Now, how much would be the vertical dimension of this zone? How much height do we need of the soft tissues? Already from the very early days of implant dentistry, there was a lot of research trying to identify this optimal height. Initially, the studies were concerning animals, but as you see in this slide, the animal models give a very, very huge diversity of measurements and probably a very low clinical relevance to the kind of measurements that we see in humans. At a later stage, there was certain human histological studies which try to evaluate the height of all these tissue components. And there are two important messages from all these studies. The first of all, there seems to be a significant variation, not only between one study to the other, but also between the same study, different individuals in the same study, but also different locations of the mouth in the same person. So depending where you will look, you might find slightly different tissue dimensions. Is this strange? No, it is not strange at all. When you're measuring anything biologically in anatomy or in physiology, we're very well aware that there is huge diversity in the measurements between different people. And this is normal. There is a Gaussian distribution, which means that there is physiological measurements with different dimensions of pretty much any anatomic site, tissue, or organ. Why should gingival tissue or peri-implant tissue be different? Therefore, I wouldn't really get into the effort of trying to define if the true height of the optimal soft tissue is 3.1 or 2.8 or 3.6, but I would just try to take out the extreme measurements and then focus on the majority, which pretty much tells us that what we're looking for is somewhere between 2.5 to 4 millimeters. If you have this height of tissue, then you have enough tissue to secure a good establishment of all the architecture you're looking for, and you can design your supracrestal complex with the aim of long-term health. Now, of course, you will have different heights and different dimensions if you're looking on the interproximal space, like in anterior teeth, than if you look in the buccal. And no matter what implant you place, if it's a tissue level or a bone level, the establishment of the junctional epithelium and the connective tissue will always occupy the first couple of millimeters approximately, and then the rest of the space all the way to the mucosal margin is going to be sulcus. And this sulcus is what we will be able to measure with our periodontal probe in all cases. Now, what is the impact of the sulcus into the long-term results? Here, I think there is a very good study that we can all use to understand the implications of a deep sulcus as opposed maybe to a more shallow one. And that was an experimental mucositis study that was conducted in Hong Kong a few years ago. What we have here is a typical model of creating mucositis by not allowing people to practice oral hygiene for a specific short-term time. As you see, the study starts with a professional cleaning. Then there is 3 weeks of abstinence from oral hygiene. The patient is not brushing, cleaning the implant. And then after this point, we have again a professional cleaning, practice of oral hygiene, polishing, and end of the study. So we can really observe how the tissue responds to plaque accumulation. And we can now, in this particular study, see how the response changes if we have a deep sulcus and if we have a shallow sulcus. So these are the two graphs that we will focus. The first one to the left is about the plaque. The one to the right is what we really need to see is the bleeding index. And the bleeding index is the indicator of the inflammation. So when you have the bleeding on probing, this is when the inflammation is getting established. The more the bleeding, the more profound the bleeding, the higher the extent of inflammation. So look at these two plots here, the blue one and the red one. And we can see now with the blue one is the shallow sulcus, which was probably about 1 millimeter. And with the red one is the deep sulcus, implants with 3 millimeter or more depth of sulcus. Some interesting things happened during these 3 weeks of accumulation of plaque. And these are the two graphs that pretty much give you the trend of these two groups. First of all, what I see here is that they both start from 0. That means when there was the professional cleaning and maintenance, there was no inflammation in any of the groups, either shallow or deep, which gives me the understanding that if you have good access to oral hygiene and professional maintenance, regardless of the sulcus depth, you can bring it to a healthy status and keep it there. Now, when the plaque accumulates for the first 3 weeks up to day 21, you see that both deep and shallow sulcus, they develop mucositis. So mucositis, inflammation, develops in the same manner, at the same pace, in the same pattern for both deep and shallow sulcus. But what happens when we try now to reverse the problem of inflammation, when we try to treat them? Then you see that the treatment result is slower and more difficult in the case of the deep sulcus. So our ability to treat the inflammation in the deep sulcus is somehow compromised. And I think this is very clear message that we can all take together. If you have to create a deep sulcus of the peri-implant soft tissue because of aesthetic concerns, because of the scalloping of the soft tissue to create the imitation of a papilla, you have to make sure that it can stay healthy through oral hygiene and maintenance, because otherwise, if inflammation is established there, it might be difficult to resolve it for us and the patient. And with that, I would like to also mention that this was a study which used tissue level implants, a very specific configuration, because there is specific junction between the implant and the prosthesis abutment, which when deep under the tissues, it might act as a plaque retention point. And what we can see when we slice implants in the scanning electron microscopy, we can actually get a much better understanding of the microanatomy, the micromorphology of the components which face the soft tissues. Here you can see to the left a tissue level implant with a cemented crown on a thigh base abutment, so extraorally cemented crown. To the right you can see a bone level implant. And there are, as we said, the bone to the implant to abutment junction, which doesn't exist on the tissue level implant. But when you look higher up, when you look in the junction between the prosthesis and the abutment, or the abutment and the implant, this is where you actually might have a configuration that can be difficult to clean in this particular case if it is deep under the tissues. Here you can even see some small cement rest. Although the cementation was done extraorally and the crown was polished, there was still some minor indentation which included some cement rest, which depending on the solubility of the cement might be minor or less after a while and create a space which can be a retention point for biofilm. So all these configurations, each implant configuration we use with either tissue level or bone level implants has a lot of significant implications. It is not my intention today to go in detail into all the different ways we can bring these components together, but what I want to make you aware of is that it matters. And we have to really spend time to think carefully, how do we want the junctions to be placed into the supracrestal complex, at what depth, how high or how low, because all these things can have implications for our clinical outcomes. So again, a small checkpoint here. Plan for a total soft tissue height between 3 to 4 millimeters. This is what we're aiming for. If you get this, that's enough to establish a good biological consistency of the soft tissues. If you don't have it, you have to make sure that you can acquire it somehow. Now, a deep sulcus is an important component, and it's sometimes necessary when we're after aesthetic implant placement, but it is not going in itself to be a problem unless we create a prosthesis which somehow obstructs the oral hygiene. And this is where an uncleanable prosthesis or a patient who doesn't clean combined with a deep sulcus can be a recipe for problems in the future. So remember, all the components we use matter, and the configuration, the relation of the components, the shape, the size, and the placement of the junctions, it also makes a difference, and we have to not leave this difference in chance, but always to conduct it after careful consideration. With that, I would like to move on to another dimension, which is what we call the emergence angle. 3 studies so far have been published which try to calculate an angle on the intraproximal space of implants and prostheses on the periapical radiographs, and have been actually very interesting and very much debated because they point to the direction of a relation of this emergence angle with peri-implantitis, peri-implant inflammation. And they all tend to agree towards the margin of 30 degrees as being the determinant between risk for inflammation or less risk for inflammation. Of course, this can be visualized in many ways. If you want to see what it means to have 30 degrees emergence angle, it means that your prosthesis up to the point of the contact point in these studies has to be falling within these yellow triangles that you see here. Can it fall outside? Yes, very easily. If you use an abutment which is very close to the implant platform, for example, as in this picture, then you can create a wider emergence profile, which, according to these studies, might correlate with higher risk for peri-implantitis. The safety zone that you would like to be is what is defined by these yellow triangles. Of course, this is an indication. It is very difficult to directly extrapolate from this data because originally the emergence angle was defined on natural teeth, and it was defined as exactly the angle of the prosthesis, of the crown on teeth, at the point where the prosthesis meets the soft tissues. Now, you cannot find this point in a periapical radiograph. Why? Because there is no visualization of the soft tissue. So we don't really know where the soft tissues are, and we don't really know if this angle really relates to the level of the soft tissues or is something different. Therefore, I think we have to use this data with the attitude of directional pointing. It points to a direction, points to something that might be underlying, but not as an absolute value and as an absolutely defined measurement. What I would like to see when I talk about emergence angles is actually two different directions. First of all, what happens at the deep part where the bone margin starts to transit into the connective tissue and the junctional epithelium, and then what happens at the mucosa margin when the biofilm accumulates in the crown and comes in contact with the soft tissues for the first part. For that, I would like to present you one older study by a group in Harvard, Gallucci and his associates, which tried two different healing abutments right after the implant placement. The first one was very wide. It was 40 degrees wide angle, and the second one was 15 degrees. So they were placed on 4 beagle dogs. They were observed for 4 months, and after that there was histological sections to find the impact of the healing abutment on the bone margin, the marginal bone level. Apparently what they found was very interesting. The wider abutment had caused bone recession, marginal bone loss. We had maintained the bone much better when we had a narrow healing abutment. Was this peri-implantitis? Of course not. This was just the remodeling at the very early phase of the healing, but already then there was an impact on the bone levels. If I come after 4 years with a periapical radiograph, this initial bone margin loss might be also correlating with an inflammation by plaque in the future and present more of a peri-implantitis picture. But it is not the peri-implantitis. What this shows is that if you push the space which should be occupied by the soft tissues, you might also push the bone away from this margin and you create marginal bone loss. So the shape and the angle matters at the bottom of the supracrestal complex, but for the marginal bone loss, not essentially for peri-implantitis. What happens with peri-implantitis? Well, peri-implantitis is something that will start, as we said, on the top, on the mucosal margin. And maybe there is another angle there that we might be interested to observe. There is the deeper angle, as we said now, and there might be an angle exactly where the crown emerges, because this is where the plaque is going to accumulate. And this is where we also see the inflammation correlating with this particular angle, an angle that sometimes expresses what we say the ridge lap, a horizontal projection or a very widening of the prosthesis exactly at the margin of the soft tissues. Here you can see at the top there is one prosthesis with a very wide angle exactly at the mucosal margin, what we would call a ridge lap. It's sitting on top of the soft tissues, while at the bottom you see a crown with a very narrow angle at the emergence profile, at the emergence point of the mucosa. And no surprise, there is inflammation on the part that is uncleanable because of this angle. So the ridge lap design is something that takes away the ability to reach the top of the sulcus and to remove the biofilm, remove the plaque exactly from this critical point. And this is what we often see connected with inflammation. Now, why do we have this ridge lap in this position if it's something that is really so well known clinically to cause damage or to promote the risk for inflammation? We can take a little bit of a closer look, not on the tissue, but on the prosthesis. So look at the prosthesis and look at the shape of the supracrestal complex. One of the things that we first see, there is too little vertical height. The mucosal margin, the first visible part of the crown in the mouth is only 1.5 millimeter away in a vertical dimension from the actual base of the platform. On top of that, the implant is placed way too much in a palatal dimension. So essentially, if this implant was placed slightly deeper and slightly more to the buccal side, we could establish a much more favorable emergence profile, probably preventing much of the risks of inflammation of the soft tissues. You see now, the implant position is only the last step in a whole key series of planning events, starting by planning the crown, designing the ideal tooth shape and size, then designing the perfect emergence profile based on the principles we have discussed about the vertical height and about the transition zones and angles, and then the position of the implant comes naturally as a result of all this design. Now the question is, can you place the implant in this position? And today, this is what implant dentistry is. Today, with the surfaces we use, with the design of the implants we have, and with our understanding of bone augmentation techniques and tissue augmentation, we can increasingly move from the old concept of put the implant where the bone is into the new concept, put the implant in the optimal position that serves the design of the new organ, and of course, the soft tissue is only a part of the system. There would be a lot of cases where you see here, this is extreme designs where the ridge lap has taken extreme dimensions. This to the left is a crown that creates areas that are not cleanable. Exactly at the top of the sulcus, the plaque accumulation cannot be removed. It's inevitable that inflammation will be established there, and there's nothing we can do to treat this inflammation unless we change the prosthesis, which of course is now another important parameter. You cannot make healthy soft tissues if your prosthesis is not designed for that. And if it is not, you have to make it. So you'll see here there is a lot of designs that cannot have healthy tissues. And you can be the best surgeon, or you can have magical disinfecting machines or antibiotics or anything you can think of. As long as you put the same crown back, you will always get the inflammation to return. That's not only in the aesthetic zone. Here is a typical example of this ridge lap as we would see it in a posterior crown. And again, without correction, this will never lead into healthy tissues. I think we have the evidence today to suggest that. Let me share with you an example of a full arch reconstruction. This is upper and lower full arch. There's a lot of problems with this reconstruction. What I want to show you, however, is how it looks like when we remove it. So if we take it out, and you can see there is a lot of inflammation. This peri-implant sulcus is inflamed. This emergence profile is bleeding without even any contact, just by removing this. And of course, one of the major problems here is that the actual position of the teeth is far away from where the implants have been placed. Now that would be impossible to maintain unless you change the prosthesis. And my favorite is actually here in the bottom. How many implants can you see on the fourth quadrant? I can help you. There is one implant here which is visible. There is one implant here which is semi-visible. And there is one invisible and inaccessible implant there. So what will happen if I remove this? No surprise. The first implant is in almost healthy oral mucosa. The implant in the middle has mucositis, and the implant which is hidden in the depth on the back side, completely inaccessible to oral hygiene, is already developed peri-implantitis. Of course, everything in the same patient. So there is no rocket science and no magic bullet there, and there is already some interesting evidence coming from a study in Spain where they had a randomized trial and they treated peri-implant mucositis in patients which had some small bridges, and in one group they did the whole disinfective treatment. On the second group they did disinfective treatment and modification of the prosthesis. So they opened up the ridge lap and the interdental spaces so that the patient can actually clean. The results were very interesting but not surprising. you can see here on the plot to the right. These are two lines, and you can see the yellow line. This is the group where we have disinfective treatment with prosthesis modification. On the blue line, we have disinfective treatment alone with the prosthesis placed back as it originally was. The interesting thing, in 1 month, it works for both groups. So when we clean well and we try to do some professional disinfection there, for the first month, the inflammation was reduced in both groups. But look what happens when the prosthesis is not modified. After the first month, it somewhat rebounds, while in the group where the prosthesis was modified and the patient could actually fully clean, the results are stable and the health is established. So, no rocket science. Very often we are creating these problems by creating some spaces in a single crown or even more in the bridge, which prevent the patient from reaching the mucosal margin where the sulcus is and keeping it clean. And there, it is not enough to disinfect. The important parameter is to modify the prosthesis to make sure the prosthesis changes to be sustainable with health, and that will be the complete treatment requirement in all these cases. So today the model of our work is to see everything as a system. And here you see a tooth which is unfortunately has to be extracted because of problems that are not repairable. In this case, we have the shape of the crown as it is already defined by the natural tooth. So all we have to do is just imitate the crown that we see in our data collection and design the new transition profile to the implant-based platform. So we can design the supracrestal complex by using the different angles that we have learned, by using the shape and the size and the volume of the soft tissues where it is, and then finally by defining the optimal implant position and securing this position by the use of guided surgery in order to make sure that now we have established the whole design of the whole new organ into the optimal combination of all these facts: prosthesis, supracrestal complex, and the implant position. We can then lock everything with a temporary healing abutment, which maintains the size and the shape of the emergence profile as we have designed it and as it was coming from the original tooth. And you can see now the peri-implant soft tissue becomes one parameter of the bigger system that aims to maintain successful clinical outcomes for the long term. And I think today we have this sequence, this line where we acquire all this data, we feed all this data into the planning software. The data combines not only the bone margins and the bone levels and the bone quality, but also the soft tissue profiles, the emergence profile, and the optimal tooth. And then that everything leads to the final sequence, which is the implant position and the final implant placement. So to sum up a little bit what we have discussed so far, I think that the peri-implant soft tissue today is perceived as the key for the long-term success. Most of the long-term problems that are difficult to resolve relate with inflammation of the peri-implant soft tissues, and I think it is no longer a matter of the soft tissues to prevent health. It's a matter of the comprehensive design, it's a matter of the prosthesis, it's a matter of the implant positioning, and all together as a system will synergize and live together happily with the bacteria, or it will go to a dysbiotic situation and create trouble for all. Remember that there is anatomic and physiological differences between the tissues. The procedures we're going to use and the design of all the components we're always going to use, this everything can finally influence the morphology and the consistency of the soft tissues. And you can't really lead into optimal health and soft tissue outcomes without having considered first the procedures, but also the components, design, and shape. And finally, design, I think, is the major responsibility of the dentist, and especially the implant dentist. Not so much only to master procedures, but to master the design. And I think we spend increasingly more time in front of our computer screens in order to secure that we have the intellectual capacity for the design, and then the execution becomes more easy and streamlined. With that, I think we've come to an end of a long afternoon hour, a lot of information to be digested online, but I hope that this has given you some thoughts, some initiation of inspiration maybe, in order to see implant dentistry and see the peri-implant soft tissues with different eyes, and as part of a different system, the future of oral rehabilitation with implants. With that, I would like to close with one of my favorite moments from this cyborg movie. It was filmed in Hong Kong, Ghost in the Cell, some years ago. During this movie, this cyborg, which is played here by Scarlett Johansson, walks in Hong Kong, and one of her thoughts is about change. And everything is changing in a dynamic environment. And what we are having in implant dentistry is a very dynamic environment. What you are going to create in the mouth with an implant is also a very dynamic environment. So change is part of the picture. We have to anticipate change. We have to plan for change and design for change. Why? Our effort to remain what we are, this is our own limitation. And today, to anticipate change in implant dentistry, we have to probably go over what we think, what we know, what we believe, and try to embrace some new paradigms that are emerging. And I think the future in implant dentistry is very exciting, as the near future as much as even the longer term. With that, I would like to thank you all very much for your attention. I would like to thank the Dental Innovation Foundation of King Rama IX for the opportunity and the invitation to be here today and share some of our thoughts with you. I am very happy to discuss online as long as we still have some time and opportunity, but of course this is an ongoing discussion. We will be discussing about these things in the long term. You're very welcome to find me through my website or my social media pages, and let me know of your thoughts, your ideas, and whatever else you would like to bring in this discussion. Thank you all very much, and I think we can have some questions or some discussion if there is already time.
Thank you very much, Professor Nikos, for your update and informative presentation today about the peri-implant tissue around the implant. So anyone who have the questions, please type on the Q&A section. I saw some questions already. So let's start a Q&A sections. There is one question about as you introduce the number of change in paradigm of the implant treatment. One thing that is also changed during the development of the implant is the implant design, implant surface, and the connection. So what do you think about this change affect the peri-implant soft tissue? This is the first question.
Thank you. Very interesting question. There has been a continuous series of changes. Changes happen very quickly, quicker than we can evaluate it research-wise sometimes. So sometimes the evidence lags behind significantly. That means new designs are out in the market, placed for many years before we can have a very, very solid understanding of the clinical implications. There are big changes and small changes, critical changes and maybe minor changes, so everything is under assessment. I think that there has been many changes in the surface, of course. The changes in the surfaces were targeting osseointegration, targeting faster osseointegration or higher quality of osseointegration, let's say more bone to implant contact and so on. All these things can contribute because now we can place implants in positions, in places which some years ago was not possible without major augmentations, for example. So it has allowed us to expand our ability to place the implant in the optimal position. Now the connections also make a very, very important role because they impact the stability, they impact the possible creation of communication channels between the oral environment and the implant components. I don't want to single out specific changes because I believe that we have examples of good changes which led to improvements, and we also have examples of counterproductive changes which actually created problems. And I think that when you move so quickly, it's inevitable to have both. I think that this is a very important parameter. I would advise people to be very aware of what exactly each change implies and go beyond the marketing concepts, because of course every change is going to be marketed as revolution. Every new design or every new connection or every new surfaces is going to be sold as the solution to all our problems. But this is where we need to be able to combine best clinical practice, experience, and the available evidence to navigate into our choices. Very good question, but really very, very big theme. We could be talking for hours. Thank you for that.
So continue with this question. My question is, right now we have a number of choice for the abutment selection, right? So from your presentation, I saw a number of the CAD/CAM abutment connect with the probably the porcelain zirconia. So if we use another type of the abutment, for example, the titanium premill, which we can create more angle or more possible position or design of the abutment in terms of promote the good health of the soft tissue around the implant and restoration. What do you think about this?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is now opened up by the technology. When implant dentistry initiated, there was a very, very little choice of components, because of course there was not so much emphasis in the components. The emphasis was get the implant to integrate, and then the rest we can somehow resolve and manage. Today, however, we move to the place where we have to individualize to a very high extent. So I see different brands now being split more and more. The catalog implant dentistry, where we select the implant, the abutment, and the crown and everything from a catalog of components, and the individualized implant dentistry, where we actually create these components by designing them on the software and individualizing in the soft tissues that we want to create. And I believe that originally the individual pathway was expensive and somehow more troublesome and more hassle, but as the technology becomes more affordable and more predictable, I think the individualization becomes more widespread. And it's not only implant dentistry, it's medicine in general that takes a direction of individual medicine. We look at the individual patient and we customize devices and medication for the particular patient. So I do believe in the future we will have two speeds in implant dentistry. The catalog one, which will be the cheap but with low precision and lower relevance with the individual anatomy, and the individual one, which will include a custom-made abutment for the specific individual emergence profile and the custom-made crown, and now we could even talk about a custom-made implant. And Professor Atifan has also some research going on with creating the implant as well as part of the whole individualization, designing and 3D printing the implant itself so we can make the perfect threads which correspond to the exact bone anatomy of the side that we are using with the perfect size in terms of height and width. I do believe that the individualization is important if you want quality reconstructions which serve the aesthetics and function, but they also serve sustainability and create the design we want. You have to go individualization. The catalog one will cover maybe 50% of what you're looking for, but will always have a little bit here, a little bit there. So if you want to make the perfect suit, you have to tailor it to your body. The same if you want to have the perfect supracrestal complex, I think this is the way to go. And I believe as we are maturing into this technology, it will become more and more mainstream.
Yes, I totally agree that if we have advanced technology for the digital, then probably the individual customized thing is going to be suitable for each of us. And probably the company would like to reduce the stock, right? Instead of the make a lot of stock for the abutment or even though the implant in the future. So let's move to the next questions. There's a question about the soft tissue graft. What type of the soft tissue graft is suitable when we need to do the graft in order to make a good soft tissue around the implant?
Thank you for that. Very interesting question. I have to start by declaring a little bit a small disclaimer. I am not a very frequent user of soft tissue grafts. I do a lot of soft tissue augmentations, but not preventively. There is a trend into implant dentistry to use soft tissue augmentation as a mainstream procedure pretty much every time you do an implant in the aesthetic zone. Apparently, there is very little evidence to say that this is necessary, and quite small evidence to say that this actually has a significant long-term impact. Most of the studies do not have a comparative nature there. And in reality, when we're working in the aesthetic zone, I think what you have to see is what is the tissue that is missing. Most of the times, in the 90% of the times, the missing tissue is the bone. And if the bone is missing, you replace it with guided bone regeneration. If you bring the bone back to where it should be, the soft tissues will follow in most cases. I hardly can expect a problem in these cases. Now, will you add a soft tissue chunk into this space? Yes, you could, but would it really matter? I'm not sure. I think where it matters is when we have complications. So when you see problems like recessions or fenestrations or mucogingival problems, this is where you need soft tissue augmentation. And this is where there is absolutely really very little reported or done. Everyone is using soft tissue grafts to make things look good, which might have looked good anyway with a GBR, but there is very little understanding when we truly have problems. So I'm not a very big proponent of soft tissue augmentation. Now, if you have to use soft tissue because you have lack of volume, for example, or because you want to increase the keratinization of the soft tissue, then there are different ways of doing things depending on the indication. I think still when you are looking for volume, I would still go for a connective tissue graft. When you're looking for keratinization, I will use a hybrid graft, which is a combination of a connective tissue surface with some small zone of epithelialization maintained. Now, there will be also xenografts today that one can use. Can you use xenografts just to bulk preemptively the tissues around implants? I think you can, but there is much less leeway of error. The vascularization is significant in all these cases. And these vascular structures, they will have to be really embedded very, very carefully in the indication there. I think that there is a space for soft tissue augmentation, but probably is not as much as might be conceived by many people in aesthetic implants.
Thank you. So every time we are thinking about the soft tissue graft, please consider whether we really need it or not, or we can start with the bone graft if we need, right? So let's move to the next question. In case that the implant was placed too shallow, so what is your recommendation? Explant and place the proper one, or frequent maintenance by remove the prosthesis and clean it? Which one is your recommendation?
Thank you. It's a difficult problem, and it's a very difficult situation. I would rather have the implant placed somewhat deeper than somewhat more shallow, because prosthetically it brings you into a significant problem. You see, the margin of your crown is determined by the aesthetics. So you cannot choose yourself how high or how low will be the margin of your crown. It will have to match the neighboring teeth. Now, from the margin of your crown, there has to be this critical zone, as we said, which is between 3 to 4 implants for the soft tissue to establish. If the implant is now too shallow, these 3 millimeters do not exist. Either you will have to make these 3 millimeters by making the crown shorter and look ugly, or if you make the crown look all right, you will probably squeeze the soft tissue zone and you will result into problems. These problems could be maybe marginal bone loss, or could be also problems with the cleanability of the implant, because you design an emergence profile that is not cleanable. How can you deal with this? I think you can deal with this based on what is the main problem created. Is it that you have to make a crown that is not cleanable, that you have a ridge lap that is difficult to clean, or is it that the crown is not aesthetic? You can't have both. This is the problem in shallow placement. You can't have aesthetics and cleanability. And if I had to choose, I would choose for a design that makes it cleanable, even if the aesthetics is somewhat compromised. Now, if you can't do that, to take out an osseointegrated implants in order to place it deeper, that's also a very big decision. It's a big hassle, it's a big situation that can have also unpredictable complications. You see, every time we operate the tissue, we make the tissue more difficult. We create more scar tissue. We create more problems there. So a second surgery to resolve the problems that were created by the first one is always getting an increased risk. I would probably see how can I make the implant sustainable, how can I maybe explain to the patient the limitations, and see how much of these limitations can be accepted by the patient, so that we can balance it in a way that we can maintain it as much as possible in a healthy status. And I think that this is very common seen in the aesthetic zone, because people have been having the paradigm of placing an implant exactly at the bone margin. But sometimes the bone margin might be actually pretty much where the anatomic crown is going to start, and that is a very big problem. So very often, especially in the aesthetic zone, we have to go deeper than the bone margin, especially mesial and distal, in order to secure the proper transition zone. And if you don't do that, then depends. Some cases there is some thoughts and some suggestions of augmenting the soft tissue to create the soft tissue zone. So say that I don't have 3 millimeters for my soft tissues, I can add a connective tissue graft to bulk it up. But then prosthetically you will be creating a smaller crown. This is another issue there. So it's all about the planning. You have to see where the compromise is and try to decide what's the best compromise to ensure sustainability. I hardly think you can take it out. Maybe very, very challenging to take it out and replace it.
Okay, good. So let's move to the next questions. Which one caused the less bone resorption, comparing between the tissue level implant and the bone level implant?
Here I think we have enough evidence. The evidence is quite clear. There is no real difference in the bone resorption rates. The marginal bone levels, when you have bone level and tissue level implants of the same brand, followed up in the same study prospectively by the same researchers. I think there is a 10-year study by Boozer and Sapui which has divided and followed up patients with bone level and tissue level implants, and they have not found any difference in the clinical outcomes in terms of marginal bone loss, but also bleeding on probing and mucositis. And I think this is another parameter. There is a very widespread belief that tissue level implants are less susceptible to inflammation. That if you are having periodontitis patients or patients with a susceptibility to inflammation, tissue level implants will actually have less risk for peri-implantitis. And this is a very widespread belief which I have encountered many times. What I have not encountered is any evidence, solid evidence to support this. Most of the people who actually say it claim of some cross-sectional studies in Sweden which apparently didn't really check this. The studies who have been looking into tissue level, bone level and inflammation outcomes, mucositis and peri-implantitis, have not shown any difference. There is only one prospective randomized clinical trial for mucositis, which in 2 years, in a randomized group of tissue level and bone level, also has not found any difference in the inflammation outcomes. So I would say that they're both really very good implants, and they're both good designs, and they have their indications, and they have their way that you place it. So as long as you follow the indications and the way that you have to place each of them, I think you can do really very good clinical outcomes. I would place a lot of tissue level implants, mainly in the posterior, in specific anatomic locations which I have enough soft tissue and I have, let's say, flat bone, because if you have an uneven bone, you cannot have a tissue level implant placed well if the mesial bone is really high and the distal level of the bone is really low. Aesthetic zone, it's also complicating the fact because I cannot really change the emergence profile. The first 2 millimeters of the transmucosal component are predetermined, and if they don't match the profile I want to give, I think they limit my ability to make the ideal profile. But this doesn't mean that you cannot use it. If you know what you're doing and if you follow the indications, I think both implants can perform very well.
Thank you. So let me check. We have any other questions? For those who are online, if you want to ask the question, please type it in Q&A sections. So from your presentation, I noticed that the implant position is one of the most important to promote the healthy soft tissue. Do we have enough evidence that show that when we use the digital technology to put the implant in the proper position, and then after that we will have a long-term success of the soft tissue or healthy soft tissue around the implant?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very good idea, and this is something to consider. There is a lot of discussion about the guided surgery today. I think static guided is almost mainstream. Dynamic guided is becoming more and more. And the levels of accuracy we can achieve when we're using this computer-assisted implant placement is actually very, very predictable and quite high. The question is, does it really matter in terms of clinical outcomes? And I think that will be a question to be answered in the future. One of the ways that guided implant surgery contributes is that it unlocks potential when it comes to, for example, immediacy. Because you can now place the implant in the exact position that you planned. You can prefabricate your prosthesis, either for immediate loading or for immediate aesthetic temporary. And then you can place it immediately. You can save a lot of chair time for you and effort also for the patient. So immediacy, I think today is a new concept, and the computer-assisted surgery is making it possible. On the other hand, if you're not going for this, would the computer-aided surgery make our implant placement more predictable and thus the design more materialized on the patient? I think that's an important parameter. So we should, if we have a sound design, have also effects in the long-term sustainability. Of course, there is one important thing here. Implant placement with computer-guided surgery is just a tool. It places the implant exactly where you planned it to be. This doesn't mean that your planning is fine, and it doesn't mean that your prosthesis is well designed. So the computer will do what you tell it, but it will be only as good as your planning was. And if we don't know how to plan, or we don't care about planning really in detail, it doesn't matter if you place it with a computer or not. Eventually, in the end, the problem will always be there. So technology is exciting, technology is amazing. The brain power is still the main determinant, and now we can focus our brain power on the design, while in the past we had to focus on the procedure. But now you can actually take some capacity from the procedure, make it simple, and focus more of your capacity in the planning.
Thank you very much. And probably, do we have any other questions? Is there any other questions from online? So if we have no questions, I would like to thank Professor Nikos for today, a very update and informative information about the Peri-Implamt tissue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for staying, and I hope we continue this discussion online. You can maybe put my last slide on. There is the address of my email address and my website address, so you're very welcome to contact me. I think I will try to upload the lecture notes from this presentation on the website as soon as possible. Can you please put my presentation on? Yeah, exactly. So here you can just take a note of my online contacts, and we can continue this discussion online. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. So before we are going to close this section online webinar, I would like to ask everyone to do the evaluations. Please take the scan of the QR code for the questionnaire on your screen. Yes. And last but not least, I would like to thanks Professor Nikos again, and I would like to introduce the next online webinar, which is going to be held next month. And the topic of the next webinar is going to be the management of the extraction site for implant placement in aesthetic region by Professor Bashley. So if you are interested to join this second webinar next month, in March, please follow our website or contact to our email address and or register to our สรท 9 Study Club. Thank you for today and see you next time. Bye bye.